Let's get started.
Okay.
All right, well, welcome everyone, and thanks for joining us for Roebling Road Trip. And I always like to give a big thank you to everyone who's made a donation. We're trying our best to offer all of our virtual programs a pay what you wish basis so that everyone who's interested in the topic can join us. And all the donations we receive of any amount, they really help the museum to host these programs, as well as to continue to collect and preserve Roebling history. So for those of you, I feel like we've got a lot of new people from Bucks County here tonight. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Lynn Calamia. I'm the executive director at Roble Museum. I started in this position right before the pandemic started. So it's been a wonderful time to start a new job, but I've had a lot of fun learning about Roebling history, people who live in the town currently, and these virtual programs really have been teaching me so much about the national perspective on Roebling, because we've been able to interview people from all over the country. I've mentioned Roebling Museum, but for those of you who haven't visited yet, you should. We're located in a former company town, Roebling, New Jersey, which is right in central Jersey on the Delaware River. The company town is a historic district listed on the National Register. It was built in 1905, and I like to say it's about 98% intact architecturally. One building burned down and one was moved. So it's really amazing. It's very immersive when you come and check out the company town. And our museum is on the site of the former steel mill in one of the buildings, the main gate, so where the workers would clock in. We've got some great exhibits and even outdoor exhibits, so you should definitely come by. On Saturdays, we offer walking tours, which I lead. So if you like what you see tonight, you can come by on a Saturday and get to know Roebling. So tonight we're going to go on a Roebling road trip, and our Roebling road trip series, it's all virtual programs, and we are using this opportunity to talk to people from all over the country. So we've been to a bridge in Cincinnati, the Allegheny Portage Railroad, Saxonburg, which is the town founded by Johnny Roebling, the Brooklyn Bridge, of course. And we are in the process of booking this is our last one for this year. So if anyone has ideas of what they'd like to hear about next, let me know in the Q&A box or send me an email, because we really are looking for our next set of speakers. So just a little bit of the run of show. Our guest Scott, he's going to give his presentation. And while he's talking, don't hold your questions until the end. Submit them as soon as you think of them, because I'll be managing the questions and the Q&A, the chat, so that when he's finished talking, we can get right into the Q&A, because I know you guys are going to have great questions. I had a preview of his presentation. It's very, very good. All right, well, I don't need to talk anymore. So without further ado, are you ready to get started?
Okay, I'm going to switch over to my PowerPoint, get that going. And here we go, the full screen. So my name is Scott Bomboy. I'm a resident of Perkasie, Pennsylvania. For the Bucks County people, you know where that is. For the New Jerseyites, we're probably about 30 miles west of you, if you're from Roebling. And my major interest is not Roebling bridges, it's covered bridges. I just published a book on covered bridges. But in full disclosure, I did do a tour of the company town back in 2016 with the Bucks County Community College Historic Preservation Program. And it's really a cool company town. It is a company town. You can tell that everything is there for a reason. One of the interesting sidebar stories is they did not really observe prohibition at all, because they were basically a private town and they were a bunch of steel workers. But it's a really interesting place. And Lynn had talked to me a while ago about doing a presentation about bridges. And my idea was originally to do the suspension bridge we have in Perkasie. On this slide, it's on the left-hand side, the white bridge. But in further investigation, I did determine there are two other real Roebling bridges that are in Bucks County that are in roads. One is in road service and one is a walking bridge. And they're similar in different ways. The Perkasie Bridge has Roebling parts, but it's not a true Roebling bridge. The other two were built by Johnny Roebling and Sons, and they're really interesting examples of the time period between 1903 and I guess 1947 was the other bridge. And my background is I'm author and historian. My book on covered bridges has been out for about 4 months. It was one of my graduate school programs when I went back and got my master's a couple of years ago. And there is some commonality between wooden covered bridges and suspension bridges. You wouldn't think that because like a Roebling bridge is steel cables, no piers. The covered bridge is the exact opposite, where it's all piers and all wood. But there are some things I found as I started looking at different types of bridges where there is people who had things in common with the two types of bridges, but even some design features. Our bridges in Bucks County, or the two on the river, are obviously on the Delaware River. Riegelsville Bridge, really north of the Delaware, below the border, out almost outside of Bucks County. And then Lumberville Raven Rock, which is above Stockton and New Hope. Lumberville is the walking bridge, the pedestrian bridge. Riegelsville is still in service. Even it's built in 1904, and it's a real interesting bridge. If you want to do the road trip from Roebling, it's not relatively difficult to go up River Road on the Jersey side. I used to live actually in Trenton, and I lived in the area in the middle of Bucks County. And it's a beautiful drive just to go up the river if the weather's decent, and you'll see other things to do, obviously. But there are two nice, interesting places to go. I live in Perkasie, which is in the center of northern Bucks County, and there are ways you could do a trip easily in a day between these 3 or 4 locations. Riegelsville is the first bridge I really want to talk about. And the picture on the left is the 1903 pumpkin flood. And I tell the story all the time about the Delaware River. The 100-year floods like every 20 or 30 years in the Delaware. There's always been catastrophic flooding there. And the covered bridges did not fare well when they had the 100-year flood every 30 or 40 years. Riegelsville lost most of its bridge in the 1903 flood, and the solution was to build a Roebling bridge to replace it. Lumberville was different because Lumberville lost a span. They put a replacement span in, and that was in road service until 1944 and early 1945, I believe. It was taken out of road service. It was the last wooden covered bridge in Bucks County on the Delaware River. And the decision was made, we'll get into in a bit, about why to not repair the wooden bridge and put in a walking bridge. But it's really unique for a pedestrian bridge. It's heavily engineered. It's top flight Roebling technology for 1947. Back in the day, and the reason why they had these big bridges on the Delaware in the 1700s and early 1800s, this is your preferred or probably your only method of getting across the Delaware. That was by the ferry. You could do the ferry or a Durham boat, and ferries charge tolls. They could take your freight across if you wanted to. You could do a passenger thing, and they were not practical for a lot of reasons. And there was a push at that time period to start building permanent bridges on rivers. The example on the left here is from Massachusetts. Timothy Palmer, probably the first covered bridge builder in the country. This was his first successful bridge, which was not covered, up in Merrimack, Essex, Massachusetts. And it's interesting because he has the island in the middle. He has 2 king post arch bridges, and he has some abutments and stringer bridges. And he used the island really as the center span. What's interesting about this when it comes to the Roeblings is his bridge on the right-hand side fell down in the early 1800s. There was a bridge designer called Judge James Finley who came in, and he was the first person to do chain suspension bridges in the country. And he put a chain suspension bridge in. That lasted for 100 years. And then the decision was made to hire the Roeblings to come in and put in the steel cabling to replace the chains. The first covered bridge in the United States is the one in the foreground here. That was built in Philadelphia. I believe it opened in 1805, but right before that second bridge in Trenton. Palmer designed this bridge. It had 3 arches. It's currently the location of 30th Street Station and Market Street in Philadelphia. So that would have been rush hour, this is probably the early 1810s when this painting was done. It's interesting because he did not design it with a cover. The Judge Peters, who was the primary investor, he talked Palmer into putting a cover on it to protect the floorboards. The bridge in the foreground was built by a gentleman named Louis Vernvog. He was another primary important bridge builder. You'll notice the difference where Hitch Bridge goes to 360 feet and it's 1 arch. Palmer's has 3 arches. Vernbog's Bridge was heavily engineered. It was really a spectacular achievement. It was called the Colossus Bridge. And here's a black and white etching of it. You can kind of see this, the grandeur of the structure. It's just a gigantic arch, which was, in I'd say the early 1812, 1813 period, was very magnificent. And the one thing it could not prevent was someone from setting it on fire. So it was arsoned in the late 1830s. And the decision was made to replace it. And there were 3 people who were involved in the project. There was a bridge architect named Young who won and then lost the bid. And then Charles Ellett, who was if you're familiar with the Roebling history, he was a competitor and friend of John Roebling. He won the contract. Roebling had hoped to get the wire contract. It would have been his first significant construction contract. He did not get that contract. It did inspire him to be more competitive in business. But on the lower right is a real example of an early suspension bridge pre-Roebling. The other great bridge that was on the Delaware River was Theodore Burr's Bridge in Lower Trenton. And this is from 1807. It's not entirely complete. It's missing like part of its top deck and some parts of the bridge. There were 2 British gentlemen, the Constable brothers, who came to the US, and they literally walked around the country for about a year. And one was a diarist and one was the artist, a drawer. And it's the drawing in Princeton's collection of that bridge. If it looks familiar, it's in the same location as the Trenton Makes Bridge in Trenton. And some of the pier work, I believe, is still being used for that bridge. Trusses are the commonality between suspension bridges and covered bridges. In covered bridge world, there's 4 different types of main trusses. The lattice truss, which we see in Bucks County, looks like the lattice in the bottom of your house, around the skirt of your house, where it's many, many crisscrosses. The bottom part is called the Burr arch, which Theodore Burr had patented, which are king posts with a long arch, which is anchored into an abutment. The middle 2 arches are called a Hal truss and a long truss. And they're cross braces. They're X's and they go into posts. That's really the structure that was adapted by Roebling and other people as a stiffening structure in their suspension bridges. To give you a sense of the size of these covered bridges, this is a picture of the New Hope Lambertville Bridge in 1874 from Goat Hill above Lambertville looking down at New Hope. That's the same length as Roebling's Great Bridge in Cincinnati. Roebling's Bridge is a totally different structure, but he was not the first person to build great bridges across rivers. And this bridge probably has parts of it from Vernbog, but it was also damaged in a flood in the 1840s. But this, since the scope of the size of the bridge, and then the size of, on the left-hand side is New Hope. There's a couple mills in New Hope, that's it. A couple of mills in Lambertville, that's it. And you have this gigantic bridge, this gigantic toll bridge on the river. This was the last covered bridge built in the Delaware in Bucks County. It was the Upper Trenton Bridge on Calhoun Street. And this was arsoned in the early 1880s also. It may have been someone who was smoking a cigar on the bridge who started the fire. And this is a great example of a Burr truss bridge. But at this point, bridge technology had gotten to the point where the wooden covered bridges were not really practical to build as new bridges. You could repair them, but you cannot really replace them with in-kind wood. The golden age of the wooden bridges in the Delaware ended really in October of 1903 when the pumpkin flood hit. There are 3 pictures I found of people who actually went out during the flood and took pictures of bridges about to be destroyed. This one's in Taylorsville, which we know now as Washington Crossing. The far left is the New Jersey side. The far right is the Pennsylvania side. And there's basically no gap between the piers and the bottom of the bridge. And that bridge was pretty much taken out in the flood. That great New Hope Bridge that we saw a couple pictures ago, this is what was left of that bridge after the flood in October of 1903. It was totally, not only devastated the wooden structure, it devastated the piers. This is a sense of the amount of destruction that the floods could cause, but also the flotsam, the jets, and the stuff in the water that would go down river. Up in Riegelsville, they had the same situation with their bridge. It was basically gone. I think 1 of the 3 spans was possibly functional. Another one floated down river and was readapted into a repair for, I think, the Milford Bridge. And their decision was to hire a contractor to put a new metal bridge in. Now, Mercer Museum has their minutes for the company. They had 13 bids within 6 weeks to do a replacement bridge. Roebling was the fourth highest bid. They weren't the highest, they weren't the lowest bridge, but the Roeblings is at that point, they were the leading bridge builders in the country. And the decision was made to spend $26,000 on a Roebling bridge. And their business at that point was diversified. It just wasn't big bridges. It was all kinds of bridges they would build. They would build bridges in parks. They would build them over creeks. They build them in a quarry if you needed a quarry. They could do them on small river crossings, big river crossings. And what they would do is they'd have an annual wire rope price catalog for Roebling, and they would basically give you options for bridges. And they had a sales pitch. They said, you know, we can build a small bridge for you for $1.50 per foot if it's for your park or whatever, your town, or you could have something magnificent like the Allegheny Suspension Bridge if you're so willing to pay for that product. The Riegelsville Bridge, I didn't really get into the history of it, but the covered bridges in the Delaware until the really second decade of the 20th century were privately owned, and they charged tolls. And after the Pumpkin Flood, there was a movement afoot to really change from private ownership of those bridges to public ownership in some form or fashion. And Regalsville was acquired in 1923 by the state of Pennsylvania, state of New Jersey. They had a commission that operated on their behalf to kind of manage that bridge. And eventually it was taken over in 1987 by the current Bridge Commission. The weight limit is 3 tons. 580 feet is not long for a Delaware River bridge. It was built by Roebling, and that total cost of $29,000 was a bit inflated toward the end because of a dispute between the contractor, Roebling, and the bridge owner. I included this picture because it's the only picture or drawing of the bridge that shows the portal of the bridge that we know that exists. And if you look at it, it's stepped and it's got 2 entryways. That's called a shotgun bridge portal. If it's a true shotgun bridge, it would have a wall in the middle. It would be very unusual. The one in Milford below it had a portal like that. But this kind of gives a sense of just how long that bridge was. The solution was to put a suspension bridge in. And these are 2 really rare pictures from Mercer Museum of the month that it opened in 1904, April 1904. It was open basically for light traffic. You can see in the bottom picture, there's some evidence of horse activity there. And this is very similar to the Allegheny Bridge kind of in construction style. There was a dispute between Roebling and the contractor, and the Regalsville Bridge Company about the cable structure. And the Riegelsville Company brought in a professor, James Madison Porter III from Lafayette, and he got in an argument with the chief engineer of Roebling, Cooney, about the number of cables that were needed. And eventually there was a back and forth about it, and the Roeblings gave them $1,500 to widen the sidewalk, and they put 2 extra cables in. What's interesting about this picture is those extra cables are not on the bridge yet. So it's just in the middle of the dispute, which went on for about a year. And you can see this structure is, it's definitely a Roebling bridge, but if you look at the 3 different spans, they all have the camber or the curve in the bridge. So in some ways, it's more like 3 bridges repeated. It's called a multi-catenary bridge, and the catenary is the cable, which basically suspends the deck and everything. Instead of having 2 towers, they just have a tower on every pier, which they reused. It's interesting architectural and engineering style. You don't see a lot of it actually. And this is a far shot. I think it's probably from the Pennsylvania side, but I can't confirm that. It shows you the bridge, but the size of the wooden structure and the piers is this totally different look. But how much, how much support those piers needed to provide to those wooden bridges on the river. This picture it's probably 1962 or 1963. It's from the Shellmark Postcard Company. You can see in here where they've added the extra cables on the anchors. So there's basically 2 cables that go through the saddle on top of the tower, and then the catenary cable is 2 cables. And they did a little bit of work on the side of the bridge. And in 1970, they There's another picture from the historic engineering record project that shows the deck. I'm pretty sure, at least in our area, it was probably the last bridge that had a wooden deck over the Delaware. And that wooden deck was eventually taken out and replaced with a modern deck. But if you look at the sides and the cross braces, they're X's, and there's no post between the X's, which would make it a true Hal post or a long truss. And at some point in its recent rehab, they put those posts in to reinforce the bridge. And you can see they've done a lot of work on it. There's extra stuff on there, like the lamps. The lamps are modern. They're not current. The black lamps that are up there. And this is really, it's interesting bridge because it's just so almost Victorian in its look and totally different than things in our area. The Lumberville Bridge came about because of several factors. It was difficult to maintain. It was expensive for the two states. And again, it replaced a former covered bridge. This picture from 1874 may be the second oldest picture of a bridge in Bucks County. This is when the bridge was in road service in Lumberville. Lumberville is above Stockton in the New Hope area. That gives you a sense of how long that bridge actually was. And the thing that would always impress me about covered bridges is the fact that they have really tiny windows and you had to go through that entirely. It may not have been the most pleasant experience. The 1903 flood took out the span there. And that's, I believe, on the Pennsylvania side. And they had a choice whether they could, replace the wooden bridge, they could put another wooden span in, or they could put a metal span in. And the economical choice was to put a metal span in to keep it in road service. And this picture from 1937 is also interesting because there's three different span types here, or truss types. It's a mixture of the metal, almost like a railroad bridge in there. And they used the lattice truss on one part and they used a modified Burr truss on the other. And at that point, I believe in the 1930s, they had probably freed the tolls in this bridge. This picture's from 1937. They were very strict about the weight limit, as obvious in this picture, that they kept a close eye on the structure of the bridge because it was delicate at that point and had some condition issues. In 1945, the decision was made to close the Lumberville Bridge. And it turned out, I found this in the old newspapers, that they did some tests after that and they had a serious insect damage problem with the wood structure, which made it impractical. It was obviously not doing well. And it really set off a controversy in the community because there was a group of preservationists, or the New Hope artist colony, who wanted the wooden bridge preserved. There were the locals who wanted a metal bridge that was for, motor vehicle traffic. The practical decision was made to not keep it in service as a motor vehicle bridge because of volume and to make it into a pedestrian bridge. And these are pictures I dug up in a trade magazine that shows the process of them. They're not clear, but it shows them actually taking the bridge apart in Lumberville. They've taken apart the wooden truss in the top picture on the left. The bottom picture, they're stringing the suspension bridge as they're taking the lattice truss down with the arch support. So they're actually in the middle of, they're using the structure of the wooden bridge to build the suspension bridge. And this is the bridge that we know today. This is a recent picture of the walking bridge. And the two things that really strike me about this is how big those abutments are, how small the bridge pathway is. And then the top part, the concrete on top of the stone abutments, that was all pre-stressed Roebling product that they put in there. This was a highly engineered bridge in 1947. It's got a lot of modern technology going on. It was top of the line for a pedestrian bridge at that point. And it's just a very unique design. If you look under, you can see the metal substructure of the bridge, just the size of the piers and just the amount of steel cabling in there. And this is the look as you're actually going between the two states and the anchoring system. What's interesting about the anchoring system is usually there's just the two cables that go in there. They have three cable stays in the bottom to give it extra support. So it's 5 cables attached to the metal tower. This was not the only Roebling footbridge they did. that's noteworthy. There are other ones. This tiny bridge in the upper left-hand corner is in a park in New Jersey. It's called the Shaky Bridge. It's a model bridge. That's a very old Roebling product. The one in the lower right-hand corner is in the old Roebling facility in Trenton, where they put a suspension bridge between two of the buildings. And those catalogs that we looked at, you could go in and actually basically shop for a bridge if you wanted one. This was the bridge from 1903, which was a pedestrian bridge in New York State. I don't know where the other one was in 1922, but these were your options if you wanted to either hire Roebling to come out and put your bridge in, or you could buy the parts and do it yourself. And these bridges still exist today. The one in the upper left-hand corner, there was a very rich person at a mansion in Greenwich, Connecticut, and they decided to hire Roebling to come out and do a replica Brooklyn Bridge to go out to their dock, which is, it's a replica Brooklyn Bridge. The one on the upper right is on a golf course in Middletown, New York. It was a trolley bridge that was converted and actually kind of upgraded more as a tourist attraction. The one on the lower left may or may not be a Roebling bridge, but that's called the Kissing Bridge at Rutgers in New Brunswick. And that's closer to the one in Perkasie design-wise. And the one on the lower right is the Androscoggin Bridge in Maine, which is definitely a Roebling bridge. Perkasie's bridge is like a Roebling bridge, but it's not a Roebling bridge. It's like a Roebling bridge because all the metal parts are from John A. Roebling's sons, but the wooden parts were added by local workers in Perkasie who were paid by the Works Progress Administration to actually do the construction job. And the origins of this bridge, in 1935, there was a very large Roebling catalog that not only showed you the bridges, it gave you all the engineering calculations down to everything. It was basically a recipe book for if you wanted to build a Roebling bridge, you could do it yourself. And they gave you all the measurements. I mean, the calculations for load bearing, trusses and everything. In Perkasie, they had a problem. They had a park. It was an amusement park called Lenape Park, Menlo Park. Lenape Park was the bottom part, which had a dammed creek that could be used for boating, and it had picnic fields. And by the 1930s, this had fallen into disarray, and there was a tentative plan to actually rebuild the park in the early 30s, which was not funded. And it was interesting because the plan was to turn part of South Perkasie into a golf course, which never came out. But they kept some of the elements of this for the later plan. And in 1936, Perkasie Borough approached the WPA, which was funding projects, and they said, we're dredging our creek. We're going to put a man-made island in. We need a bridge. And they came back with a plan early 1937 from a civil engineer called Alan Orr, who was in New Britain, who had worked for the highway department and later worked for a major engineering firm. He drew these plans. So Alan Orr is the architect of the walking bridge in Perkasie, but it's very clearly a Roebling influenced design down to the anchor system and all the hardware. And if you look at the side view of the bridge, it's very classic Roebling. It's got the stiffening truss, it's got cables, it's got towers. The towers, the foundation of the towers are as deep as the height of the towers. It's got the cable stays on the ends. It is definitely heavily Roebling influenced. And even down to how he designed the suspender rods. The suspender rod on a Roebling bridge holds the deck platform, basically. And this is highly detailed, but it's just so Roebling when you look at it. And one of the reasons why is when they did the contract, they sent these plans to the bidders for the contract for the metal parts and said, well, you have to be as good or better than Roebling in designing steel bridge parts. So obviously Roebling was the only bidder, and they got the contract and they supplied all the metal parts. The bridge opened in 1937. This is a picture from the early 1940s. It shows the man-made island in the middle of the creek. They had widened the creek, they had dredged it. They put in it's really one bridge with two spans with the island in the middle. They had a landing for boating. This was quite the project, more for the engineering of the creek. It only took them about 3 weeks to build the bridges. Once they got the approval and they got the parts, and the parts came in from New Jersey, or definitely New Jersey. And they used local labor to do this, day laborers. And there's obviously was a civil engineer, either or somebody was there as a site engineer, but they did this project relatively quickly. And even today, when you look at the bridge, it's in relatively good condition. We've had to do rehab work on it for various reasons. It's in a heavily moist area, so it has to be relatively clean, and it has wooden components. We did rehab work about 2.5 years ago, and this shows this the amount of, like, stuff on the bridge from being above water with trees. And they're in the process. Our local Rotary Club actually did a lot of painting and the rehab work for us. We did the deck and the columns. And the cleaned up bridge has maybe some more wooden planks on it. We did pay for replacement tin caps and made sure they were the authentic whitewash color. And this shot shows you kind of the classic understructure of a Roebling bridge, where you have the stiffening trusses, the X's, you have the cables, steel suspension rods holding up the beams under the deck. And this is really, really built solidly. The Roebling parts are still there. They have the word Roebling on them. They probably were in that catalog from 1935. This is an anchor block for the bridge. And what you can't see is that eye hook, which holds is part of the socket, that extends about 4 feet into the concrete. That's how deep those concrete anchors are. The island itself is a little different than before. It's kind of overgrown. One of our projects will be to clean this up in the borough. But what was interesting, what Ord did is he has the same anchor holding both bridges, and those are designed as park benches. So it's a really interesting use of the technology and design factor. And an example of how well this bridge was built, we had the flood last year in Perkasie, where we had between 8 or 10 inches in the park. The entire park was flooded. The water was above the deck on the bridge, and there was a dumpster and an apartment complex that floated downstream and slammed into the bridge. Bridge did not move. The dumpster flew backwards. This thing is really built like a tank, and it's highly engineered product. And my final slide before I take questions is, if you think back to that 1792 bridge, which was the first bridge in the US that was significant, it's got a little bit in common with the Perkasie Bridge, where whether Orr knew it or not, he used the same design that Palmer did when he did his first significant bridge. And it's really interesting technology and design. If you have a chance to go to Perkasie, if you're not a local, there's other things going on here. It's just worth the drive to get a close-up look at a bridge like that. So that's my formal presentation. I'd be happy to take questions about the bridge in general, the 3 bridges or covered bridges at this point.
All right, well, let me take a look at what came in while you were talking. Someone asked about the Hendricks Island Bridge. Do you know anything about that one?
No.
Martha, do you? My board chair is in the comments right now typing things. We'll see.
I know about the one in Texas. I didn't include that, but Waco has a bridge.
No, she said, I think not. Well, then that's one I have to learn about. Maybe you can let me know. Justin Spivey dropped in the historic American engineering record photos for people to take a look at, which are really, really amazing. And Martha said that the Rutgers Kissing Bridge is in the Roebling catalog.
Excellent.
Which is really interesting. I gotta go look on that one too. In terms of actual questions, what do you know about S.A. Cooney, listed as engineer on the Riegelsville Bridge? Was he a degreed engineer?
That is a good question. I know I did research and I dug up his obit. He was the chief engineer in the New York office. He had a lot of patents. So you'd have to assume that he was, trained as an engineer. I mean, he was the top engineer for Roebling, which would have been, a significant position. And he was there, and I think until the 20s or 30s, until he passed away. He was like the road guy. I know he, when they had the pumpkin flood in 1903, he was sent to Passaic to put up a bridge like within 3 or 4 days, because they had a problem with the roadway up there with their main bridge because of the flooding. So I don't know. His obit is in the New York Times, so I could find that out at some point. But I would assume he was. Sever and Cooney.
Alan also asked, why was Roebling listed as being based in New York and not in Trenton? What year
They
are
were
we
both
talking about?
based in
that
both
bridge?
places.
There's lots of satellite offices. I'm trying to figure out around what time this would have been to see if they would have had.
Well, they
a New
had
York
all the
office by
issues and
then.
working with union stuff and steel in general. So, that's why they set up the Concord Works. I know that. But they still were in other locations.
Another question that came in, I feel like some of these are for me, not for you. I really wish I knew all the answers. Did Roebling patent any of the designs? It seems the company was very generous about showing the technology in catalogs. What I would say is that typically that wasn't really public. I think it was certain parts of it were released to other businesses. And I know that there are certain engineers and people who worked for the company who had their name on patents that became Roebling products. And John A. Roebling, I think Charles Roebling, they do have patents on specific wire rope things. But I wonder, I don't think that they could patent suspension bridge. I think it's much smaller than that, the things that they have patented. I think there's pre-stressed concrete patents out there, a couple of other things. I've gotten, okay, so Justin Spivey just said Roebling wanted to sell wire rope and fittings, not bridge designs, which I think is a really good point. We have an exhibit opening on October 1st. That's why I look so stressed out right now. And we are including a whole section on the fittings because they really are, if you look through one of those catalogs, it's like 90% fittings and the little bits that attach the wire to the bridges. And it's sort of something that you don't really think about, but I think it must have been a good amount of their business. Even when the picture you showed with that said Roebling on that, the little connector bit.
Right.
All right, do we have any other questions? I mean, my question for you is, which is your favorite bridge? I feel like you know them all in that area. Doesn't have to be a Roebling.
Oh, well, probably the Perkasie covered bridge, obviously, for me. And the Lenape Park suspension bridge would be number 2. So we disqualify the Perkasie bridges. There's a bridge in Easton that's really interesting, which is a metal bridge, actually designed by James Madison Porter III, which is really funky bridge, which I would recommend. And of the ones in Bucks County, probably that's a tough question. It's just not wooden bridges, but we do have 12 covered bridges in the county, so we have a choice to pick from.
Here's a question about floods. I love that that's called the pumpkin flood. Do you know why it's called the pumpkin flood?
They had so much destruction. It was October and the pumpkins were floating down the river. Along with what would have happened, unfortunately, is say if there's a bridge above Riegelsville, part of that bridge would come down the river, smash into the next bridge, and it would be like a set of dominoes coming down. And eventually it would come down to the bridge in Trenton, which was Burr's original bridge. And that bridge and the ones that replaced it, they were never damaged by floods because it was built so high. Plus the other bridges would take the abuse for it pretty much by the time stuff got down there. It was because of the season where the pumpkins were out and they were all in the river actually.
That's really interesting. Okay. Can you comment on the 1955 floods effect on the 2 bridges that you mentioned? You did talk about it a little bit.
Well, 55, that's not my covered bridge era. It took out the last covered bridge in the Delaware up in Columbia, the Columbia Coca-Cola Bridge. I know the bridge in Yardley was taken out, I believe. And I mean, not all steel bridges are impervious to flooding, unfortunately. But in Lumberville, I think there may have been some damage to that bridge. I don't know about Regalsville.
My dog's barking. Are the Lenape Island bridges on the National Register? Have they been nominated? Or is the park nominated? Any of that?
We're in a discussion with the State Historic Preservation Office about that. We can't exactly agree. So.
Oh,
whether-
yeah, we've talked about that before. I think
Yes,
that's
and
one of
the
reasons.
issue is Lenape Park is eligible for the register because it was designed as a landscape park by the WPA. It was also the first creek around here to be stocked, and the Branch Valley Game Club was involved in that project. It was totally landscaped design park by the WPA, so the park itself is eligible, and we would go for that as the eligibility. Whether that's part of a bigger district or whether that's on its own is a different question.
Yeah, it's a lot of work to fill out those forms.
Well, you have to figure out, do you want it with the entire town, or do you want the park by itself, or you want the bridge by itself? The bridge would easily qualify. It's so heavily documented.
I agree. Did S.A. Cooney do the Regalsville Bridge? Apologies if you mentioned that already. Okay.
Yes, his name's actually on it.
Oh.
There's a nameplate with John A. Roebling's sons, and it says S.A. Cooney Engineer.
All right, last call for questions. Do you have any others before we wrap up? I think we might have gotten them all. Well, thank you. So his name is also on the Greenwich Bridge. Greenwich.
Oh, the one up
Okay.
on the
York.
bay. Yeah. That's quite the bridge if you can afford one. as your bridge to your dock, you know.
All right, well, thank you so much, Scott. This
Sure.
has been fabulous. I hope we can still stay in touch with all of your bridge activism.
Absolutely, and it's. I would highly recommend going to Roebling for the walking tour. We did I think our class did 2.5 hours for it, and there's a lot of people don't know about the Roebling company, about how important they were in many ways, not only to business but to like American culture, and how bridges were modernized. You look at the wooden bridge era compared with the suspension bridge era, it really changed things a lot.
That's a great segue for me to plug an amazing event, a rare opportunity to get to go into 5 of the historic houses, the historic company townhouses. That's on October 8th. And you also, a ticket to that gets you in to see our new exhibit that we curated with the Smithsonian. Huge busy time at the museum, but it's a rare opportunity to get to see from like labor, lowest paid worker, all the way up to the mansion. So you not just get the town tour, you get to go into the houses. So I hope some of you guys buy tickets. I'll be leading some of those tours too. It'll be amazing.
Sounds good.
All right, everybody, have a good night. Thanks for being here with us.
Thank
And
you.
as always, our programs are put up on our YouTube shortly afterwards. So check those out too. Bye.